All right, the little red light is on, and if the sound of my voice is meeting your ears, then that means you have recently hit play. Here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome to you. Everybody else, what's up? How are you? What are you doing right now? Are you driving in your car? Are you sitting at your coffee table? Are you taking a walk or a run? As many of you know, if you've been around, I often have mused in this moment about where you are and what you're doing right now while you're listening to this. I so appreciate that you have chosen to bring me into that moment. I hope it's going okay. If you were around last week, I was frustrated with my neighbor snowblower, and I think I was talking about, keeping your patience in the midst of things, and I did an okay job this week. I feel like I managed to keep my wits. It does feel like quite an effort to keep sane against the forces of the machine. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean, the forces of the machine? Well, I'll tell you exactly what I mean. Longtime listeners have heard me talk about my eldest daughter and our struggles around her having a phone and Snapchat. Remember, I was talking about Snapchat. So I had set up some parental controls in the form of screen time settings, which means I get to set how much time she has access to what. And basically right now, it's my only leverage. It's the only leverage I have with her right now. To get her to do anything that we need her to do is to sort of threaten her with not getting as much screen time. In my day, we would get grounded. Remember? You weren't allowed to go over to your friend's house because you were grounded. Nowadays, I guess we could do some grounding, but the screen time is more immediate. In any case, it has recently come to my attention that my daughter found a way to hack around it. She figured out that if she just changes the time zone of her phone, she can dupe it because the screen time settings are according to my time zone, not where her phone is. So she figured out a way around it. And I have to admit, some part of me is impressed. Like, I would have done that if I was her and I was in the same situation. I know myself, I would have searched around. I would have seen if there was a way, and if I had figured, I would have figured it out, and I would have done the same thing that she did. And I got to give it to her. It's smart. She figured out a hack. Fortunately, I think there is a way for me to seize back the control. We'll see if I can make it work, but I need access to her phone to do it. But I really felt like my attempts as a father to set boundaries for my child were just thwarted by the tech, like someone's ability to hack around whatever it is there in almost all of these systems. And of course, I just have to trust that my daughter will also be getting something from me or learning something from me, so that at some point she'll have a relationship to these devices and be setting boundaries around them in a way that'll help her be healthy as a person, because it's really not healthy. And I have some fear, I must admit, around the way that children are developing in relationship to these phones. Like when I see my daughter and her friends and how they interact and they're all on their phones at the same time together, it really tweaks me out. And so I managed to keep my wits about me despite that. And what I think I was also talking about last week, and I have remained focused on, is finding the windows of hope and joy and finding people who are pointing to those windows, because it's pretty easy to get overwhelmed by all the suffering, and finding those windows where I feel possibility and hope are so valuable right now. And I'm very happy to say that my talk today with Josh Thomas is certainly an example of where I'm finding windows of hope and joy. Josh and I met through his participation in my year-long teacher training program. And throughout the year of 2022, I was having conversations with Josh in these teacher training meetings. And then I was having all these conversations here on the show. And a lot of the episodes from the podcast were really interweaving and being inspired by some of my interaction with Josh. And I've had it in mind for a long while to record a talk with him, but it is one of those moments where someone I know, not from recording the podcast, just from my interactions with people in yoga inquiry and as a teacher, bringing them on the show is always an interesting melding of worlds for me. But Josh is really someone who I have taken a lot of inspiration from, and I really appreciate the way that he speaks about things that are often impossible to find words for. So I was really happy that we came together to have this talk, and it is a pleasure for me to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to that, I wanted to mention that I am currently in the planning stages for a tour of sorts. I'm trying to put together some weekend gatherings. If you recall, I did this in 2019, and I was prepared to do a big one in 2020 before the world fell apart. Well, I'm trying to get myself back in the saddle again, and I am currently planning. So I'm putting out a call to anybody who's listening to this who wants me to come to where you are. We don't need a lot of space. We don't need a lot of people. We just need the will to make it happen, and maybe a little bit of timing. So listen, now's a really good moment to reach out, because I'm doing the planning right now. So if you're listening to this and you think it would be fun to have me come to where you are to have some practice and talk about some stuff, reach out, okay? And if you want to make sure to know where I am going to be going, the best way to do that is to be on my free email list. I don't know if you're subscribed to that already. If you're not, I would encourage you to go to the website and subscribe to my free email list, because that's the most direct way for me to be in touch with you and let you know where I'm going to be and when. And also, while you're there, you might check out the other stuff. There's ongoing classes online that you can take. There's my weekly discussion group. There's the teacher training program that I was just mentioning. All of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, let's leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and get into this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Josh Thomas.
Hello?
Hello, Josh.
Jay, how are you?
I am okay. How are you?
I'm doing all right.
All right. I know you know the deal.
I do know the deal.
So let me just say thank you for doing this.
Hey, sure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
I have to say it's a fun melding of different, I don't know, avenues that I have dialogue in. You know, there's this being recorded for the show thing that I do, but then there's the different like discussions that I have in those Zoom meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I spent, you know, a good year in some dialogue and exchange. And in that dialogue and exchange, as I think we've acknowledged to each other, at least for me, it was really right at the tip of where like my own personal inquiry was. So it often felt very vulnerable in a very good way.
Well, for sure. It appeared to me that you and I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Please say what you were going to say.
It appeared to me that you and I were endeavoring in certain areas at the exact same time.
Yeah.
And that is why we came together in the way that we did. And for me, anyway, it continues, as I'm sure it continues for you.
Yeah, it does. And it was coming together on very challenging areas of inquiry in a way, or difficult to share in areas of inquiry is what I would say. Like certain things that have to do with just the breathing and the moving practices and sort of general principles are like, as we often talk about, sort of a substrate for other things that often are kind of happening individually in a way. And as I've been trying to talk about on the show, as you know, for teachers, sometimes it has to do with this kind of being honest with ourselves about improvisatory space and like what's happening there. And I guess one thing I have to say to you, Josh, which is really kind of amazing to me because I feel like I know you some because we had all those conversations over quite some time. But I went to prepare for this talk today with you in the same way that I would prepare for any other talk that I do for the show, because I have like a whole process that's just part of doing the show.
Sure.
But you by far have like the least digital footprint of almost anybody who's ever been on the show before.
I have a website. That's about it.
You do? I couldn't even find your website. I found you on one page of someone else's website, but I literally couldn't find your website. If you have one, I need you to send me the link. I couldn't find it. So I have like nothing. I have no notes prepared, which is very appropriate.
What a blessing that is. That means we're both coming into this in the moment. And we can talk about whatever arises in that moment without any preparation. I mean, there's preparation because there's well over a year of knowing one another. But my experience is that if we go into it without any preconceived ideas, as much as we can, then we stay out of that sticky realm of thought and we can be in the moment.
Well, I feel like I put myself in a position, which I guess is on purpose, where I really have no choice. Because here we are. I have to say, I do feel like I know you, but in other ways, I really feel like I don't know very much about you. And you don't have to divulge anything about yourself that you don't want to. But I guess I am curious because you do seem to bring a perspective to certain things. One, which I will say I had in mind, if there's one thing I had in mind for us to talk about, would have to do with the idea of like energy and healing, because I recorded another conversation that you haven't heard yet that will likely post before this one, where I spoke with someone who was an energy healer, and he spoke about it in ways I thought were really interesting, because sometimes when people talk about energy and healing, I don't buy it.
Sure.
But with this person, I really did. And he talked about actually being able to see, auric bodies and stuff, which was very interesting. So you're someone I know who is kind of working in that realm, but talks about it in ways that I haven't heard other people talk about it, or seems to have a perspective on it that's a little bit different. And my suspicion is that's because you came to it later in life and maybe had another incarnation. And I guess I'm curious about that. Like, did you have a former life before you were doing this kind of healing work? And if so, what was it, and what made you change your life?
Well, I've had a lot of incarnations, as everybody does. And I could go on and on about those. The most relevant ones, what led me to the yoga, I believe. And if I go back in throughout my whole entire history, this has been here in every moment. I just haven't been aware of it. But in every instance of the incarnation, whatever incarnation that has been, there's been a subtle voice, an undercurrent that is different. And these are the words I have now. I didn't have the words at the time. There's a voice that is sort of like in the background that has a different texture or a different flavoring from my thoughts and my emotions and my desires and my expectations and my memories and all of those things that are those components of mind. And in each incarnation of Josh, ego structure Josh, as it has changed, that voice, as I've given it more of my intention and attention, has gotten louder, more clear for me to hear and follow, and the textures become much more palpable, much to where I can in moments understand more fully when it's not that voice that's guiding me and talking to me. And as I've embraced the voice, and this isn't necessarily a voice I hear, although sometimes that happens. This voice is a knowing. It's a kinesthetic feeling. It can be words. It can be like downloads where all of a sudden you just have like a memory, but it's not a memory. And throughout my whole entire life, this has been there as I reflect. And if I reflect enough and get into sort of an altered state, I can find it just about every single moment. But the first moment that I heard it very clearly came, as I think happens for most people, in a transition state of deep suffering. I was in my early 20s. I had done all the things that culture tells us we're supposed to do. You go to college and pick a vocation, and none of that felt right. And these are the words I have now. None of it felt right, though I couldn't admit that at the time. And I had moved from the Northeast to the South, United States, with a woman that I was with. That was a painful ending of a relationship. And it seemed like most of the structures that I was building were collapsing. And there was a lot of deep pain and suffering in that moment, as I'm sure many people can relate to. And I had a habit of numbing out, partying, getting stuck up in my thoughts and analyzing things. And there was a moment where I came home one day and I felt all the pain arising, and I heard that voice. And I had a knowing that I could either continue, I could have a cocktail and sit on my veranda and listen to Bobby Dylan and sort of numb out. Or I could go, and this was still numbing out, but I could numb out in a different way through exercise, which was something that I was not keen on at that point. And I heard the voice just say, essentially, it didn't say it in a way, but there was a knowing that I just had to put on some shoes and go for a run. And I listened to it. And for days after that, every time the anxiety would arise or the pain would arise, I would just go to the gym in my apartment complex and essentially run myself into exhaustion. So that I didn't care about the feelings necessarily. I'm not saying that's a healthy thing to do, but it's what I did.
I think many of us know of which you speak as a thing to do to help you through.
But that was the beginning, I did that for a good while. And then, of course, as these things happen by happenstance, it was my brother who was like doing the P90X program. Mm-hmm. And he started I wanted nothing to do with that. And he said, I think you'd really like this yoga tape, Josh.
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, whatever, sure. Okay. And the one day I just did it, and it was hard. And, and as a reflection, it's not anything that I would do now.
Do you know the irony? I'm going to interrupt you for just a second because there's a deep irony in that, because when that came out, when P90X came out and it had that yoga video in it, I wrote a blog post about it, something like, is P90X yoga or something? And I like did a whole thing. There was like a whole to-do in the blogosphere about that. So the fact that that was your first ever yoga is a kind of a great irony for me in that. Just goes to show that sometimes people say, you know, people's entries can be wherever they are. Don't judge them. So it's true.
For sure. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And so I did like, I don't know, 20 minutes of this thing. And the very next day, my anxiety went down from, if it was at a level 10, it was at a level 2. And I was bursting with what I would call joy and excitement. And I had a knowing, again, that voice came in, a knowing that that was a very important piece for me. And of course, there's a whole story that goes after that, you know, a whole list of memories where I would practice, and the practice got stronger. And then my ego structure felt like it had to become a teacher. So I went down that route and put on all of those costumes. And
when you say practice, you mean yoga specifically or other types of practices?
Well, I would say yoga. I would do yoga. In that stage, it was the breathing and moving practices.
Yeah.
Specifically. But as I reflect on that, there was this undercurrent of not good enoughness that was driving me into those breathing and moving practices. So if I fast forward, I would say 5 or so years later, another incarnation of Josh came, and this was totally by happenstance. But I had this was the early days of podcasts, and I was listening to a man. I did not understand what he was talking about at the time, but he would talk about people like Ramana Maharshi, and his main guy was Nisargadatta Maharaj. And I would listen to his satsangs all the time, and I couldn't stop. And I was very fortunate to have a sales job at that time where I was traveling a lot. So I had time to put my earbuds in and listen. And while I would listen to this satsang, everything this guy said would make sense. And it was like he would come up with all sorts of different concepts and ideas and, you know, essentially talking about what I would call now love. And they wouldn't seem to tie together. But by the end of the satsang, it's like every single point that was made would make perfect, complete sense. And when I would stop listening to the satsang, it would go away. I wouldn't understand what I had heard. I couldn't recall what was said. If anybody asked me what I spent my free time listening to, I couldn't describe it. But there was this pull into that for probably a year or two. And the shift happened for me, and it took me a long time to be able to talk about this. But my wife and I, we weren't married yet. I was living in a condo. It's an old cotton mill that was renovated into condos. And so everything's very old. And I was lying on my couch looking up at the rafters. It's like these beautiful giant beams that are painted a very pure white and black contrast around them. And there was a moment where all of a sudden, in an instant, all the boundaries to everything stopped. They didn't exist anymore. And I saw the rafters turn into these swirling colors, and the contrast turned into swirling colors. And everything it's almost like it was paint mixing together and blending, but in a continual moving flow. And I had 2 recognitions in that instant that also felt eternal and timeless, by the way. I had my first clear understanding that everything is just energy change. It is matter continually changing form, moment to moment, in a timeless, eternal state. And that what I think I am is not what I think I am, and that nobody actually dies. And it wasn't a concept, it was a knowing. It was like deep in my gut, a knowing. And here's the shift. All of a sudden it stopped and the boundaries came back. And I had this initial flood of excitement, like I had just, it's like a little kid, like how a little kid sees something new, like a butterfly flying, and they just get like super stuck in joy, bursting with joy. And moments later, I could feel the stress chemicals filling my body, and this existential fear and terror started pumping through my body. And without any doing of my own, my body took over, and I flew off the couch and started sprinting around my apartment building, and then collapsed in a heap, sobbing in utter terror. And it was this paradox where that's all I wanted to be in, but I was too afraid to go there. And so after that, I kind of shut it off. But
can I ask you a quick question before you go on? Can I ask you a quick question about that? Because that sounds very much like the descriptions that I've heard people describe when they call whatever, like a Kundalini awakening or something, whether we want to call it that or not. But was that a totally spontaneous occurrence? Was there any kind of other experiences that you could recall that seemed to be like indications of that? Like, why were you open to having that happen to you in a moment like that? Or was there something that led to it, like an impetus or something?
There would be moments where I would look at people and I would see things, much like your other guy you were talking about. I could see like lines of current coming off of their body. And it would be sort of like an instant. But in that instant there, I could recall it right now. If I bring that instant, any one of those instants up, I could see it very clearly in my mind. But they were all like, it was like that. What I described was level 10 experience, and they were very much not level 10 experience. They were sort of like flirting.
And there was nothing that happened like that day that like propelled that all on you. Just showed up while you were sitting on your couch looking at the ceiling.
Totally normal day, lying on my couch. I don't even know what I was doing before that. That all seems insignificant. But after that, that started to shift in my whole life, my ego structure. As I look back at it now with these words that I'm using right now, in retrospect, I could see that the structures of my ego were then falling apart in an ordered fashion. Sort of like that continual flow of energy was shifting the being of Josh in the most comfortable way it possibly could to bring me to where I'm supposed to go, wherever that is. And so, we changed our living situation, and I changed my career to a very different career, becoming a massage therapist initially, shifting into what I call a body worker, and now more recently into the energy realm. And I can recall instances where there was a continual death of an earlier incarnation of my ego. It would usually come by putting my fists up against certain ideas. For example, there was a time where I would never have done yoga. I would have definitely not been open to that. And then poof, not only am I doing yoga, but I endeavored to be a teacher. Then there was a moment where I never would have imagined myself as a massage therapist. And then poof, I became a massage therapist. There was a very clear moment where I was in massage school and we were doing these mock interviews. Massage school is like a trade school. So they do some of the college type things that I had already gone through in my college experience. But we had to do like an interview, a mock interview with an employer. And my employer was supposed to be like a physical therapy or chiropractic type office, because I was going to be a massage therapist that only worked with physical bodies. That is the most powerful thing we can do. And there was this moment where all of a sudden, again, I don't know if this is a dissociation or something, but my awareness came up out of my body and started watching Josh describe how I was only going to do physical neuromuscular related work and not energy work, because energy work is silly and it's not real. And Nobody can convince me otherwise, and I'm going to do the actual work of working with physical bodies. And I could see in that moment, from that vantage point, remembering that the moments before yoga and the moments before massage, and I had the thought, oh no, I can see where this is going now. And I came back down into my body, and that same level of fear came, not the same level as seeing the non-dual state, but I kind of closed down. And so, go ahead.
I was going to say that moment right there where you were saying that you weren't interested in energy work, that happened after the kind of intense
way after,
brush
yes.
up with
it was
the dissolving of all boundaries. And that dissolving of all boundaries that left you in a fetal state or whatever. I guess my curiosity is, were you able to like talk to your partner and other people in your life about what happened?
My partner, yes. My wife, as weird as things get, and I'm here to tell you that what I've just told you is
only the tip of the iceberg.
Only part of it, and we can go there much later. Maybe not today, but much later. And as weird as I have gotten, she has been very supportive, and not only supportive, but she says things like, cool, that's great. Her role has been more as a grounder. She is very naturally open and sees things in a very different way than I do. I tend to float up, and she is very good at grounding me. And I would say I found her through complete surrender, I believe, by grace, not by any doing of mine. It was well before non-dual state. But when I met my wife, there was this knowing. I met her one time, and it took like a year to turn into a relationship. We were friends before that, but there was this feeling when I met her that it's like, oh, it's you. You're the one. And simultaneously, there was a complete okayness if she wasn't. It's like I knew the relationship was going to happen, and I was completely resolved to be okay if it didn't. In a paradoxical way.
You know, I will say I didn't think of it as you're the one, but I felt like, oh, you could be someone I could be with, and I'm on board.
Sure.
And I'm on board.
Totally,
and I was like on board from the very beginning, and have been ever since. I kind of know the feeling, because I spent a lot of time waiting, you know?
Right, yeah.
Like not jumping in when I knew, and I didn't have that sense of knowing that you're talking about. I relate to the sense of knowing and coming out of some experience of that boundaryless place. That seems very familiar to me. So when does it start to shift from I don't care about energy work at all, I'm just doing body work, to it all being about energy?
Well, it's not all about energy by any means.
I know, okay, fair enough.
Bodies are part of it.
Bodies are only because you made that comment about everything being energy.
For sure.
But
so I started doing my work as a massage therapist, and as any massage therapist I imagine can relate to, you're working in a very quiet space with people, learning how to feel really super subtle things with your hands and your knowing and your intuition and all that. And so over the course of years of working day to day in that realm, my perceptual ability and my awareness got very heightened. And so if you couple the perceptual ability, the heightened perceptual ability, with those knowings, that sort of guided me along the way, where at first I didn't have the ability to feel really subtle things, so I had to use hard pressure, more pressure, deeper pressure. But as the sensations became more palpable, the deep pressure got lighter and lighter and lighter. To now sometimes, very commonly, it can be felt even well off the body. But I would say it all came from realizing that there are very different levels of perception. And not everybody is at the same level, although everybody, I believe, can be at the same level. So it's been an evolution in that way. So everything has gotten me here in an ordered fashion, sort of guiding me to become who I am right now in the process of who I'm going to be in the future.
Mm.
If there is a future. And what I see that is as, and this is something Ram Dass would always say, and I love it, is that you have to become somebody and then you have to become nobody. And so it's a continual releasing of the somebodyness to become nobody. And as you become more of nobody, these things, I believe, naturally occur.
I think they do too. I guess I'm curious, are there, like, you have to really trust your experience because everything in the world around us is telling us something otherwise than what you're saying in
for
certain
sure.
regards. Like
That's the inner teacher.
Secular materialism that is the thick veil. So I guess, have you doubted it? I imagine you would have from time to time. And what are the things that have convinced you? Like, what's the proof been for you that keeps you resolute in what is a very, unconventional worldview, essentially?
My own direct experience is the main source of my confidence in this. Getting to my own direct experience. As you know, I have been very interested in things like parapsychological research and psychic phenomenon. Now, I would point out that another word for psychic is just intuitive. And another word for intuitive is just awareness. So you can use whichever word you like.
See, because I've been talking about intuition a lot, but I have never used the word, what did you say, psychic?
Parapsychological.
Parapsychological. I've not used that one.
So there are a lot of researchers with high degrees, science-minded, that do research into parapsychological fields through the lens of materialistic science. And anybody with any desire to look into that can go and find an abundance of evidence that these states are real beyond probability, which is all scientific studies are looking for. And there are things like non-local perception, also known as remote viewing, non-local perturbation, or having the ability to influence matter at a distance. This would be things like spiritual healing, telekinesis, telepathy, all of which I would note are talked about in Yoga Sutras as the cities.
Mm-hmm.
And so, which I don't believe are supernatural powers, I now understand them to be evolutionary states that human beings are moving toward. Just like being able to see physically is a utility or a power if you don't have the ability to see physically.
Mm.
And so in talking to parapsychological researchers and reading their books and investigating myself and coupling that with my own direct experience of these states, over time, there was sort of at one level, there was like, oh, I don't want anybody to know that I'm open and interested in this because I don't want to be seen as weird based on my cultural conditioning. I don't want to be shunned from the culture. But over time, meeting people that are similarly interested and meeting people that are not just interested, but putting their whole long careers on the line to do this work, and having my own direct experience of the love that comes from some of these people continually gave me more and more confidence to embrace it and talk about it, as I'm doing right now.
It feels risky.
It can be risky if I'm identifying with my Joshness. If I am focusing as my ego structure, and I'm sure some people don't like that word, and not identifying as what I have discovered is awareness or my soul.
You see, I was going to ask, and you said it's awareness and soul. You're kind of putting them together. Interesting.
Well, I think awareness includes the soul. But if I'm identifying as my ego structure, my Joshness, then there's going to be a lot of fear that, again, I could be shunned. And this is shunned or at one state, burned at the stake or hung, like the Inquisition would do if you entered into this realm. There's an incredible book written by a man named Thomas Zaz, and I believe it was written a very long time ago. He's a psychologist. He's probably dead now, but it was written around the time where mental institutions were becoming very popular. And for any number of reasons, you could be locked away and medicated, sort of one flew over the cuckoo's nest style. Mm-hmm. And he wrote this book called The Manufacture of Madness, where he relates that time period of the psychological industry coming into science, and anybody that showed these states being locked in the institution or medicated, pulled out of the culture. He relates that very directly to the Inquisition, to the witch hunt, where the power structures, when they saw somebody wielding something that they didn't understand, something that could influence their control, they were taken out of society. And that book is, it's a very interesting read for people that like to read.
Yeah, I haven't read that book, but I have read about that period in those asylums. And, I heard it also talked about, from the author that I remember reading who was talking about it in terms of how we moved from, that's the time when we moved from whatever the worldviews that people held that weren't secular materialism into kind of this, oh, well, if you believe that, you're crazy.
For sure. And I'm not saying that, like, if you think your dog is telling you to kill your family or your neighbors, then you need those services. You should not be in society if that's happening. This is not me telling anybody that they're not useful. But when the power structures kind of dive in there just to sort of fulfill their own worldview and hold on to their own power structures, that's when I believe it becomes a problem. So you had mentioned materialism as a worldview, as you and I have talked about before. The only way this makes sense. So, for example, you can take just about anybody on this planet and run them through doing remote viewing. And so remote viewing would be, you get in a relaxed state, you're guided to look into some future state where you are either at a place or you're looking at an object or a picture of an object that you do not know about. And you can very clearly see in your mind images. You can get impressions of what it's like, shapes, colors. You can draw it. You can see it more real than real at times. And then the picture comes up, the image, the thing comes out, or the place is seen, and poof, you've seen it in your mind. So theoretically, if someone goes through that process and within their own mind, not being influenced in any way, they have this direct experience of what is a precognitive state and a non-local viewing state, you would think that that would be enough to maybe turn a true skeptic into more of a knower. But that's only true if they do not subscribe to the full worldview of materialism.
Yeah, you would just write it off as coincidence. I got lucky, or
you would fulfill your own worldview in any way that you could, even if it was crystal clear. But if you have a worldview of a consciousness-based reality, not where this meat suit that I'm wearing and this brain that I have is creating the reality, although it is in a way, but that this meat suit that I'm wearing and the brain is made out of consciousness, which is what it's sitting in, which is what everything is made out of, then from that worldview, there's an opening possibility. And so what leads people, and I'm not saying this is a believer thing. I believe people, I just use the word, people that are true doubters or non-believers and people that are super believers are the same. Until you have your own direct experience, a belief is a belief is a belief. If I'm believing in this without any experience, it's no different than if I don't believe it without any experience. So I'm going to take belief out of it. this is what, the Yoga Sutras and these mystical traditions talk about. They sort of tell people not to get stuck on the cities. And I believe that's wise in some ways. But the power of these parapsychological researchers is that they can use the lens of science to bring it into the zeitgeist. They can bring it into the world in a way that can show people through science, holding their hand, that yes, these states are real. And that starts to change a worldview paradigm, little by little by little.
So you see the science looking at it as a way to convince people of a different worldview.
I think that's its only true utility in a positive, loving way. I think it's really easy when people discover that these are real and they learn the protocols, how to use them. They can be used for really bad things.
But even as you described, though, even after someone has a direct experience, because I think a lot of people have direct experiences that would be proof of the sorts of things that you're saying, but either they're not aware of them or people don't have a frame of reference. I remember reading something about the strangeness curve. So if you're having an experience that's too far away from like conventional accepted realities, you don't have any way to talk about it with anybody. You don't have any words to describe it. You don't even know you had it.
Sure. Until you have that experience, and then you can look back in your memory.
And then be able to have an awareness about that experience, right?
I believe so.
And in order to have that, you'd have to be in a space, or like at least be open enough to a worldview that is not entirely bound by a materialism.
It would include materialism. It would not only be materialism.
Right.
A consciousness-based worldview includes everything, because consciousness makes everything in that worldview. It can't be the other way around.
All right, well, here, let me ask you something, because you said just now about the cities and how they sort of warn against, not focusing too much on them. And I think I've had a conversation with you about this before, where I personally kind of came up against them in a way where I lost interest in any focus on them at all, because I felt like there was something potentially reckless.
Sure.
And so I guess I'm curious about that, like, when I said earlier that sometimes when people talk about energy healing, I feel uncomfortable. I think that's generally because when I hear it talked about, sometimes one, it feels like it's being made into some kind of supernatural ability, or even when it's not, even when it's more like, oh, this is all in our potential as our beings. And even as you said, it's all part of an evolutionary process. It feels to me that like the healer has too much of the power, and that's why we've had some conversations around higher power.
Like they're He-Man.
What's that?
Like they're He-Man. I have the power.
Yeah, or like because like what you said, okay, so you're like, if there's this oneness and we're all part of it, and there's this evolutionary process of us coming into awareness of that, how I feel about this, that there's some point where there's like, you said the word guidance earlier. Where's that guidance coming from? And is there a certain amount of like humble pie that is required in any of this?
I think there's a guiding true north here that one can sort of mark their attention and their intention on, and that is love. If these cities, if energy healing, if spiritual healing, if yoga, if chanting, if on and on and on, is done from a place of love, and I don't mean sexual love or platonic love or emotional love. I mean fundamental, fabric of the universe kind of love. God is another word for love. Then I believe people get there by taking themselves out of it and radiating love or joy. And so if I'm sitting here working with somebody and I think I'm doing it, I think I'm going to move their energy with my very powerful, strong energy moving ability.
With your perceptual abilities, right? The perceptual abilities that you have.
First of all, I'm going to get depleted myself because, it's like taking my life force. It's not accessing a different thing. And second of all, they will probably feel terrible. And then the ego builds. And then rather than being Josh the massage therapist, I become Josh the sorcerer, the huge, big
creator of the universe. That's what you become.
There's no surrender in that. The way I experience this. And, I looked into things like Reiki and other energy modalities. And I'm not saying anything bad about them. This is not me degrading them.
Is there a particular modality that you associate with now, or are you just drawing upon a lot of different things?
The way that what I do has evolved is that I read things and learn things and talk to people and research modalities, and then I practice them in a way, and some bits work and some bits feel like they are something I should do, and other bits don't resonate, and so I let them fall away. And so what I do becomes sort of, as I think everything is, I think this is what yoga practices do as well, is it becomes very personalized. It becomes it includes the gifts that I have as an energy body being person. In the same way that when you do your work, they are attuned to Jay. And so what I have learned is that when I'm working with people, I have to sort of intuit where people are themselves.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.